The night was cold, the stars bright against the endless stretch of sky, and the winds of the prairie carried with them the sound of silence, a silence only broken by the weak cries of a child. She was huddled near the half-burned embers of what had once been a campfire, her arms wrapped protectively around the infant pressed to her chest. Her dress was torn, her hair matted, and her eyes hollow, carrying the weight of something far heavier than exhaustion. When the rancher found her, he said nothing at first. He stood in the shadows, watching the way her shoulders trembled not from the cold but from the sobs she tried to choke down. The baby's whimpering grew, its small fists waving helplessly in the night air, demanding the comfort she could no longer give. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped closer, the crunch of his boots on the dry earth making her stiffen. "Don't touch me," she whispered hoarsely, her voice so raw it was almost painful to hear. "I'm broken." The words hung there, fragile yet sharp, like shards of glass in the wind. She clutched her child tighter, her body recoiling from the thought of another hand reaching for her, another presence pressing against her battered soul. The rancher didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't ask her what had happened or who had left her in such a state. Instead, he simply lowered himself to the ground, slow and steady, until he was eye level with the baby. He held out his calloused hands, not toward her, but toward the child, as if asking permission without words. Her eyes searched his, suspicious, desperate, wounded. But the baby's cries were rising, urgent, and she could feel her strength unraveling thread by thread. Reluctantly, with a trembling motion, she let him take the child. The rancher gathered the baby into his arms with surprising gentleness, his big frame shielding the small life as though it were the most fragile thing on earth. He didn't try to comfort her with words she couldn't believe in. Instead, he began to rock the infant slowly, humming low under his breath, a deep, steady sound like the earth itself breathing. The baby quieted almost instantly, its little chest rising and falling in rhythm with the motion, until the cries melted into hiccups and then into sleep. The woman watched, her body rigid, her hands still frozen midair as though she regretted letting go. But there was no malice in the rancher's face, only a quiet determination, a patience born of years spent tending land and livestock, of weathering storms without complaint. She turned her face away, shame burning in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was the shame of being broken, or the shame of letting someone else carry her burden, even for a moment. Tears slipped down her cheeks silently, catching on the dirt and blood that stained her skin. The rancher didn't speak, even then. He didn't ask her what she meant by broken. He didn't promise her healing or safety or love. He just rocked the baby until its tiny fists went slack, until its breathing grew soft and even. Only then did he glance back at her, his expression unreadable but not unkind. The fire between them sputtered, throwing weak shadows across their faces. She hugged her knees to her chest, curling inward as though she could disappear into herself. The rancher shifted the baby against his shoulder and leaned back against a rock, still humming, as if the silence of the plains was a lullaby that belonged to the child alone. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she felt the crushing weight in her chest ease, if only slightly. Not because she was healed, not because the pain was gone, but because for one fragile moment, she didn't have to carry it all by herself. She didn't dare say thank you. She didn't dare trust him. But she watched him, and her hands slowly uncurled from their fists, her body slowly loosening from its cage of tension. And in that lonely night, beneath the indifferent stars, she realized that silence, too, could be a kind of mercy. Under the blanket of the western night, the land stretched vast and unforgiving, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of mesquite trees and the whispering grasses that swayed in the restless wind. The prairie was a place that didn't care for the brokenness of people. It swallowed them, tested them, pressed them until their bones felt hollow. Yet on this night, two souls sat near the fading glow of a dying fire, a woman hollowed out by sorrow, and a man whose silence spoke more than any preacher or poet could have managed. She had not slept in days, the constant fear gnawing at her, the baby's needs dragging her awake each time exhaustion threatened to steal her away. The rancher had not asked for her story, but he didn't need to. It was written in her swollen eyes, in the way she flinched at the sound of his boots shifting against the dirt, in the tightness of her jaw when the night reminded her of past terrors. She had built a wall around herself, but walls made of grief always cracked under the weight of silence. The baby shifted in his arms, fussed for a moment, then nuzzled against his rough shirt and drifted deeper into sleep. His voice, low and steady as he hummed, blended with the whistle of the wind. She wanted to look away, wanted to claw back the child she had surrendered for fear that even this kindness would betray her, but she couldn't. Instead, she found herself staring at the hands that cradled her child, the same kind of hands she had seen wield ropes and reins, the kind of hands that fixed fences and bore scars of hard work. They were not the hands of a man who took without asking, they were hands that had learned patience, strength, and restraint. Hours passed, and neither of them moved much. At some point, the rancher draped his worn coat across her shoulders without a word. She had whispered before that she was broken, and maybe she still believed it, but the warmth of that coat felt like an anchor in a world that had set her adrift. She pulled it tighter around herself, burying her face against the collar, breathing in the scent of leather, sweat, and the faint sweetness of tobacco. When the baby stirred again, rooting and fussing, the woman reached out instinctively. The rancher transferred the child back into her arms with a care that made her throat ache. She turned her body away, trying to shield the child as she nursed, but there was no judgment in his eyes, no hunger, no pity, just that same steady stillness, as if the earth itself had taken human form and settled beside her. She didn't ask him why he had stopped when he saw her by the burned-out campfire. She didn't ask where he had come from or where he was going. Some part of her feared the answers. Another part didn't care. All she knew was that he hadn't left, and that was something rare in her world. The night wore on. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carrying across the barren land. The woman pulled the baby closer, trembling despite the warmth of the coat. She had seen men with smiles that hid teeth sharper than any wolf's. She had learned to hear danger even in laughter. But this man didn't laugh. He didn't try to soothe her with words or tell her she was safe. He simply kept watch, his eyes scanning the horizon, one hand resting lightly on the rifle propped beside him. Her mind drifted back to the last town she had stumbled through. She remembered the stares, the whispers, the way people looked at her as though she were a story they didn't want to hear. A ruined woman, they had called her. She remembered the men who had reached for her, not to comfort but to claim, as though her brokenness had made her free for the taking. She had run until her feet bled, until she thought she might collapse, and still she had run, clutching her baby as though he were the last piece of herself worth saving. And now here she sat, a stranger's coat on her shoulders, a stranger's silence protecting her in ways words never had. The fire cracked weakly, throwing sparks into the air that died before they touched the ground. The baby slept again, sated, wrapped in the folds of her dress. She leaned her head back against the stone behind her and closed her eyes for the first time without fear of what the darkness might bring. The rancher didn't move. He sat as though he had all the time in the world, his gaze never leaving the horizon. Perhaps he was used to long nights of watching over calves or waiting out storms. Perhaps he knew that sometimes the only thing a soul needed was someone willing to share the silence. When dawn began to stretch its pale fingers across the land, the woman stirred awake, startled to realize she had truly slept. The baby lay against her chest, warm and breathing softly. She blinked against the light and found the rancher still there, leaning against the rock, his hat tilted low over his brow. He hadn't slept. His eyes were shadowed, but his posture was relaxed, as though the long night had been nothing but a habit. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, the memory of her own whispered words echoing in her mind. "Don't touch me. I'm broken." She wondered if he had heard them as truth or as a plea. She wondered why he hadn't walked away when she said it. Most men would have. Some would have stayed to prove her right. But he had done neither. The day grew, and with it came the heat, pressing down on the land like a smothering hand. The rancher rose finally, stretching his long frame, and began gathering kindling. He rekindled the fire, brewed coffee in a blackened pot, and handed her a tin cup without comment. She accepted it with hands that shook, though not from fear this time. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, she felt the gnawing hunger inside her ease with the bitter warmth of the drink. He shared jerky and hard bread with her, leaving the larger share for her without acknowledgement. Every gesture was wordless, every act quiet, as though he understood that words could wound when silence could heal. When the baby fussed again, he glanced over but said nothing, turning his eyes politely away as she tended to the child. The smallness of the moment, a man respecting her space, honoring her fragility without pity, made her chest ache worse than any cruelty had. The sun climbed higher. They sat in the sparse shade, her baby nestled against her, his hands folded across his belly as he slept again. She studied the rancher when he wasn't looking, trying to read the story written in the lines of his face. He was not young, though not old either. His hair was touched with gray at the temples, his skin weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, when she caught them, carried the stillness of someone who had endured storms without bending. She didn't know his name, and he hadn't asked for hers. Somehow, that felt right. Names could be burdens, too. The day slipped into evening, and evening back into night. Another fire burned, stronger this time. She found herself speaking at last, her voice raw and halting. She told him of little things, the baby's name, the way he smiled in his sleep, the sound he made when he was hungry. She didn't tell him the rest. She didn't tell him of the men who had hurt her, of the family who had turned away, of the nights when she had begged God to take her instead of forcing her to. Keep breathing. That story stayed locked behind her teeth. But the rancher listened anyway. He didn't interrupt, didn't press her to say more. His silence was not empty, it was a shelter, a place where her words, however small, could land without judgment. As the stars wheeled overhead, she caught herself watching him rock the baby once more, his big hands steady, his voice humming that same low tune. She remembered again her whisper from that first night, the words that had been her shield and her prison, "Don't touch me. I'm broken." Maybe she still was. Maybe she always would be. But for the first time, she wondered if broken things could still rest in the hands of someone who didn't try to fix them, only held them gently enough that they didn't shatter further. The prairie stretched endless and merciless around them, but within the circle of their small fire, a fragile kind of peace settled, a peace she had thought would never belong to her again. The second morning came quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears until every little sound grew sharper. The chirp of crickets, the rustle of dry grass, the distant bray of a mule somewhere far across the prairie. She woke before the baby stirred this time, her eyes opening to find him already awake, sitting near the fire, coaxing the flames with a patient hand. His hat lay beside him, and the light caught in the threads of silver at his temples. She studied him in that half-dreaming haze, the way a person might study something they weren't sure was real. He didn't notice her at first, or if he did, he gave no sign. His movements were steady, deliberate, as though he'd been born to them. She wondered what it must be like to move through the world without the constant weight of fear bending every step. For her, every sound had become a warning, every shadow a threat. Even sleep felt like betrayal, as if letting her guard down for 1 second would cost her everything. But when she looked at him, she saw no fear, no rush, only steadiness, a rhythm as unshakable as the earth beneath them. The baby stirred, making a soft noise, and her body reacted before her mind could catch up, gathering him close, checking his face, his breath, his warmth. The rancher turned then, not sharply, just a quiet glance that took in mother and child. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and turned back to the fire. She hated how her throat tightened. For so long she had lived with nothing but suspicion and harshness. Every man she had known had taken something, her trust, her hope, her safety. And now here was one who took nothing, who seemed to want nothing. That emptiness, that absence of hunger in his gaze, was what unsettled her most. He brewed coffee again, passed her the tin cup with the same wordless manner, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She took it with both hands, the warmth seeping into her palms, chasing away the chill of the night that still clung to her bones. She sipped slowly, letting the bitterness wake her fully. The baby slept on her lap, his small hand curled against her side. "Where are you headed?" she asked finally, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. The rancher looked at her, his eyes steady, then back at the flames. "Home," he said simply. The word struck her harder than she expected. Home. She had no such word anymore. Home had been burned away the moment hands stronger than hers tore her world apart. Home had turned to ash when she realized no one would protect her, no one would come looking. The thought made her chest ache, and she looked down quickly, hiding her face against the baby's soft hair. "You?" he asked after a long pause. She let out a bitter laugh, so sharp it hurt her throat. "Nowhere," she whispered. "Nowhere left." He didn't reply. He only stirred the fire, the silence between them heavy but not cruel. The day stretched long and hot. They packed what little there was to pack, and he motioned for her to follow. A horse waited beyond the rise, a big roan gelding with kind eyes. She stiffened at the sight of it, Memories flooding, men on horses, men who had chased her down, men whose laughter still rang in her ears when the night grew too quiet. She clutched the baby tighter, shaking her head. The rancher didn't push. He loaded his own gear onto the saddle, adjusted the reins, and walked beside the horse instead of mounting. He set the pace slow, his boots crunching against the earth, the horse trailing obediently behind. He expected her to walk, she realized. He expected nothing else. Something unknotted inside her chest at that. The prairie was endless, stretching out in golden waves that shimmered under the sun. They walked until her legs ached, until the baby cried and she stopped to feed him in the meager shade of a twisted tree. The rancher waited a little ways off, giving her space, drinking from his canteen without glancing her way. By the time the sun dipped low again, painting the sky with blood and fire, she could barely feel her feet. The rancher stopped near a stream, tethered the horse, and set about building another fire. She sank onto the ground, clutching her child, too weary to speak. He cooked beans and bacon in a battered skillet, the smell filling the air. When he handed her a plate, she took it wordlessly, her hands trembling as she ate. The baby gurgled beside her, tiny fists waving as if he could grab hold of the stars overhead. She smiled faintly, a fragile thing, and caught the rancher watching. Not with hunger. Not with pity. Just watching, as if the sight of a baby smiling was something worth seeing. "Why are you helping us?" she asked suddenly, the question tearing from her like something she had been holding too long. "Why didn't you leave me there, like the others did?" The rancher looked at her, long and steady. "Because you were there," he said simply. Then he returned to tending the fire. She stared at him, her throat tight, tears stinging her eyes. It wasn't the kind of answer she had expected. It wasn't a promise or a declaration. It wasn't even comfort. But it was the truth, plain and solid, and something in that truth settled into her like a stone dropping into water. Night fell, and once again he rocked the baby to sleep when her arms grew too weary. She watched him, every motion gentle, every sound low, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel the need to whisper her warning. She didn't say, "Don't touch me." She didn't say, "I'm broken." She only sat beside the fire, wrapped in his coat, listening to the baby's breathing as it slowed against his chest. The journey continued. Days bled into one another, the prairie shifting slowly into rolling hills, the grass thicker, the streams clearer. She began to notice little things, how he always gave her the easier share of food, how he checked the horizon before resting, how he walked on the side closest to the open land as if shielding her from what might come. He never touched her, never pressed for words, never demanded trust. Yet trust began to grow anyway, creeping in through the cracks of her defenses, quiet and persistent. She told him more about the baby, stories of small joys, the sound of his first laugh, the way he clung to her finger. She didn't tell him the rest, not yet. The pain was still too sharp, the memories too jagged. But he listened, nodding now and then, and in his listening, she found herself lighter. One night, as the fire burned low and the stars hung heavy above, she dared to ask, "What's home like?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Quiet," he said after a moment. "Land's wide. Got a cabin. Cows, some horses. Work every day, but it's honest." "Alone?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "Always been." She looked down at her baby, who slept between them, his little chest rising and falling. Alone. The word made her shiver. She had been alone too, but in a different way, surrounded by cruelty, abandoned by those who should have stood by her. Alone in the worst sense of the word. But his aloneness sounded different, like a choice, like a life built from silence rather than from loss. The days grew into weeks. Slowly, she began to laugh again, softly, uncertainly, but laughter nonetheless. The baby grew stronger, his cries louder, his smiles wider. And the rancher remained the same, steady, quiet, present. One evening, after a long day's walk, she whispered the words again, though they sounded different now. "I'm broken." He looked at her, his eyes calm, the firelight dancing in them. "Then you're still here," he said. "Broken still holds." She didn't understand at first, not fully. But as the baby stirred and the rancher took him gently, rocking him once more to sleep, she felt the truth in it. Broken things could still be held. Broken things could still survive. Broken things, it took him gently, rocking him once more to sleep, she felt the truth in it. Broken things could still be held. Broken things could still survive. Broken things, in the right hands, could still find a place to rest. And though she said nothing more, though he offered no promises, something deep inside her began to stitch itself together, not into what it once was, but into something new, something strong in its own way. The prairie stretched on, but no longer endless. For the first time, she began to see it not as a place to be lost in, but as a road that might lead somewhere after all. The day they finally crested the ridge and the ranch came into sight, the woman felt something inside her she hadn't known in so long she almost didn't recognize it: hope. It was a simple place, no grand fences, no manicured paths, just wide pastures and a cabin of rough-hewn logs with smoke curling gently from its chimney. Horses grazed nearby, and the distant lowing of cattle rose with the evening air. To her weary eyes it looked like a fortress, not of stone or soldiers but of peace. She hugged her baby tighter as if to anchor herself to the moment, afraid if she blinked it might vanish like a mirage. The rancher didn't say much. He just pointed with a tilt of his head. Home. One word, steady as always, yet it carried something heavier this time. She followed him down the slope, her legs trembling with both exhaustion and anticipation. Every step closer to that cabin felt like trespassing into a world she wasn't sure she deserved. Her mind whispered the old words: broken, ruined, unwanted, but the baby stirred against her chest, and his tiny breath warmed her skin. For him, she had to keep moving. When they reached the cabin, the door creaked open under his hand, and she was met with the scent of wood, leather, and earth. It was small inside, but warm. A fire glowed in the hearth, and simple furniture filled the space: handmade chairs, a rough table, shelves lined with tools and supplies. Everything bore the mark of work, not wealth. It was no palace, but it felt safer than any place she'd known in years. The rancher set down his gear, removed his hat, and glanced at her in that quiet way of his. She didn't need him to say anything. The gesture was enough, it was permission. She stepped inside, her heart thundering, the baby shifting against her. For the first time in months, she wasn't under the sky, wasn't exposed to the cruelty of the open world. She was sheltered. She was inside. He laid out a blanket for her and the baby near the fire. He cooked supper the same way he always did, without fuss. Without waste, without words. She ate slowly, the warmth filling her hollowed belly, and the baby cooed softly in his blanket. When the rancher finished his meal, he didn't retreat to his own corner, didn't leave her stranded in the silence. He sat across from her, his presence solid, a reminder that she was not invisible here. That night, she lay awake listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of both the baby and the man who had carried them this far. Sleep should have come easily, but it didn't. Her mind wandered back to the nights of terror, the hands that had bruised her, the voices that had mocked her, the family who had cast her away like spoiled bread. Her body shook as memories washed over her, and she pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from waking the child with her sobs. Then she heard it, the same low hum she had first heard by the burned-out campfire, that simple tune he always rocked the baby to. This time it wasn't the baby who stirred, but her. She turned her head and saw him awake, sitting upright, humming into the shadows. Not looking at her, not reaching for her, just humming. As if he knew she was fighting ghosts and was giving her a rope to hold onto in the dark. Her tears slowed, her breath evened, and at last she slept. Days slipped into rhythm. The rancher worked the land, fixing fences, tending cattle, chopping wood. She watched at first, wary, clutching her baby as if work might turn to violence at any moment. But it never did. He came back at midday, shared his food with her, checked the baby's smile with that rare softening of his eyes. Little by little, she found herself helping. At first it was small things, fetching water, stirring a pot. Then more, washing clothes, mending shirts, feeding the animals. Each task reminded her she was still capable of something other than surviving. The baby grew stronger, crawling across the floor, reaching for everything with curious hands. The rancher always set aside a moment to lift him high in the air, steady in his big hands, until laughter spilled from the child's mouth. That laughter filled the cabin, echoing against its walls like sunlight after a storm. She found herself laughing, too, hesitant at first, then fuller, as though the sound had been waiting in her chest for years. There were nights when the darkness tried to claim her again. Nights when she curled in on herself, whispering the words she had once spoken with such finality, "Don't touch me, I'm broken." Sometimes she whispered them aloud, sometimes only in her heart. But every time, the answer came not in words, but in the simple presence of the man across the room, rocking her child or humming that same low tune. He never argued with her brokenness, never tried to deny it. He simply carried the weight alongside her, as if to say brokenness was not the end. One evening, as autumn wind swept across the plains and leaves scattered against the porch, she sat outside watching the horizon bleed with sunset. The rancher finished his chores and joined her, lowering himself onto the step without a word. They sat in silence, the baby asleep in her arms, the sky turning from gold to violet. "I used to think I'd never belong anywhere again," she said suddenly, her voice low. "That no place could ever want me." He didn't turn to her, didn't break the horizon with his gaze. He only said, "Place don't care. It's the people that do." The words struck her deep. For so long she had believed she was cast out not just by people, but by the world itself. But here was proof, a roof over her, land beneath her, food on her tongue, that maybe the world hadn't cast her out at all. Maybe it had led her here. Winter came harsh, the kind that clawed at skin and froze water buckets solid. She feared. The cold would break them, but the cabin held strong, the fire constant, the rancher tireless in his work. He carried wood until his shoulders ached, hunted meat when stores ran low, patched walls against the biting wind. She did what she could, sewing, cooking, tending to the child, and slowly the cabin became more than his. It became theirs. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled like wolves outside, he still kept to his silence, still never pressed against the fragile barrier she held between them. But the baby often woke, shivering, and he would take the child into his arms, tucking him against his chest until warmth returned. She would lie awake watching, her heart aching with something she hadn't let herself feel in years, safety. By spring, the land bloomed again, and with it, she began to bloom too. She no longer whispered that she was broken. The words had not vanished, they still lived in the scars of her skin, in the shadows of her mind, but they no longer ruled her. Brokenness was not a chain anymore, it was a truth she carried, one that didn't keep her from walking forward. The rancher never changed much. His words remained few, his movements steady. But in those silences, she had found something more powerful than speeches. She had found a place where her wounds could exist without shame, where her baby could grow without fear, where she could simply be. One evening, as she tucked her son into his blanket, he reached his little hand toward the rancher and spoke his first clear word. "Pa." It was not learned, not taught, not coaxed, it spilled from him naturally, as if the bond had been written long before he could speak it. She froze, her breath catching, waiting for the rancher's reaction. He looked at the boy, then at her, and in his eyes there was a question, not a claim. She felt tears rise, but this time they were not born of pain. She nodded, just once, and the rancher's hand settled gently on the child's head. The cabin seemed to exhale then, as though it too had been waiting for that moment. And she understood something she hadn't before, that sometimes healing didn't come from forgetting the brokenness or pretending it had never happened. Sometimes healing came from finding someone who didn't flinch at the cracks, someone who simply stood there, steady as the earth, while you gathered the pieces in your own time. The seasons turned, as they always did, and life went on in its quiet, steady rhythm. Work never ended, storms still came, nights were still long. But the ranch was no longer a place of solitude, it was a place of family, forged not by blood but by choice. She never forgot the night by the burned-out fire when she had whispered those words like a warning, like a curse. But when she remembered now, she remembered also the silence that had answered her, the hands that had rocked her baby to sleep, the steadiness that had carried her across the wilderness. And in that memory, she knew that brokenness had not been her ending, it had been the road that led her here.